I've been helping lawyers understand financial and accounting concepts for most of my professional career. And that experience led to my most popular presentation workshop series, Accounting for Lawyers. In that series, one of the things I find helps lawyers start to understand accounting is changing our mindset. Some lawyers get hung up on accounting being about numbers, and that might be true if you're the person doing the accounting. But if you're just trying to understand the accounting information, the numbers are actually the least important thing. So if you're a lawyer who feels uncomfortable around accounting and financial information, take a leaf out of Warren Buffett's book and think of accounting not as a series of numbers, but as the language of business. The accounting and finance fields are full of jargon that can often make accounting concepts really hard for non-accountants to understand. To perhaps overwork the analogy, the reason that accounting can be so difficult for lawyers to understand isn't because it involves numbers, it's because that you're doing the equivalent of trying to watch a foreign movie without subtitles before having learned any of the vocabulary. These Accounting for Lawyers episodes will help you build that vocabulary by focusing on common terms. In today's episode, let's start with one of the most confusing sounding terms, the general ledger. So what is a general ledger? A general ledger is simply the list of all transactions and adjustments for a company. If we don't specify a time frame, then normally we're talking about the transactions and adjustments for the current financial year. If you've never seen a general ledger before, here's a typical example. In this screenshot, we have journal ID, which in this system is a unique identifier for each transaction or adjustment. The next column is type, which tells us the type of transaction or adjustment. We then have the journal date, which importantly is the date of the transaction or adjustment, not the date the journal was entered in the system. We then in this system have the user ID of the person who entered the transaction, the subledger code, which I'll come back to, and the GST code. That last one is not normally of particular interest to lawyers, it's just about whether and how GST applies to a transaction. So back to subledgers. If the general ledger is a list of all of the transactions and adjustments for a company, well, what's a subledger? Well, put simply, a subledger is a subset of the general ledger. In other words, it's a list of specific types of transactions and adjustments rather than being all of them. For example, many of the codes here reference the creditors subledger, which is a list of all of the company's transactions and adjustments that relate to creditors, normally their suppliers. If we turn back to our example, it's important to note that not every general ledger is going to look like this. Different accounting software suites will present information differently, but it is all the same basic premise, a list of transactions and adjustments. A couple of really useful tips for you. In most systems, double-clicking on a transaction or adjustment in the general ledger will open up a pop-up that will show you more detail about that transaction or adjustment. Most systems will also allow the user to export the general ledger to a more useful file format like Excel, and this will often be what would be most useful if you're briefing a forensic accounting expert. I recently presented a webinar with my colleagues Dean Mitchell and Luke Hammond-Giles on using financial information in investigations, which included general ledgers. So if that's of interest to you, contact me directly for access to that webinar recording. So there you have it. Next time your client CFO or your forensic accountant is talking to you about a general ledger, you'll know they're just using professional jargon to talk about a transaction listing.